Hey everyone, welcome back. So this is part 2 of our Atari Lynx II rebuild and repair. In part 1, we had a bin full of Atari Lynx II parts, and we're trying to get one working Lynx out of those parts. In part 1, we focused on the power circuitry and rebuilding that. In this video, we are going to recap the entire system. It's an old system. Capacitors in this one I don't believe are faulty, but for a little bit future proof and some maintenance, we're going to go ahead and replace them. You can get replacement capacitors from Console 5. They sell kits for the specific model of Atari you have, and just like the power rebuild kit we bought from them, it's just easy and convenient, and they have good quality stuff. So I put the board in my board holder, and I'm just going to go through and show you my process for removing a capacitor or two and how I replace them. This will be done in relatively real-ish time, and then I'll probably speed up the rest of it so you guys don't have to sit through the whole thing. So I apologize if the audio sounds a little off. The original recording audio got screwy, so I had to voice over, and it's a lot tougher than it seems. So there's a capacitor hiding under this brass or this copper tape, copper shielding. And it's probably one of the more tougher ones to get out. Not that it's tough to get the capacitor itself out, it's just since it's underneath the copper shielding, there's more steps involved. So a good way to prep the legs of the old capacitors for easier removal is to just apply fresh solder to it. Applying fresh solder just helps whatever tool you're using, be it a desoldering gun, a solder sucker, or a braid. It just helps it absorb the solder. So you can see me applying fresh solder to the two capacitor legs, and basically that will prep them up and make it easier for my desoldering gun to take out the solder and remove the capacitors. So here is my desoldering gun. I'm just going to place that over the legs of the capacitor and just let it sit there for a second. And then when you pull the trigger to suck out the solder, just wiggle the tip of the desoldering gun so that it breaks up the leg and breaks up any loose solder and absorbs it better. And if done properly, you'll see it comes right out. And that's what adding the new solder helps with. It helps it just, come out that easily. So now we're going to focus on lifting up this copper shielding and getting rid of the capacitor that's underneath there. So for this, you're just going to take your soldering iron and you're going to heat up each point, each solder blob over there, and lift up the copper shielding, just like that. So we're going to move around and just do that for all the solder blobs you see until we can get enough clearance to just fold this up and out of the way, just like this. It should be good enough. And then you want to pay attention to that little piece of tape that is covering the legs of those capacitors. It's there so it doesn't touch the conductive part of the copper shielding, because then that would cause shorts and the system wouldn't work. So just want to remove that, and then that'll give us access to the capacitor legs that we can then remove. With the tape removed, we're going to tin up the legs of the capacitors so that we can get a cleaner pull from the desoldering gun. And pro tip, not that I'm a pro, but when you're working on things like this, just always make sure that you move the board or whatever device or thing you're working on in a way where it's easy for you to access and work on. I didn't have this luxury because I'm trying to get it recorded, and with the board holder it doesn't make it too bad, but I figured I would mention it just so if someone's trying to do this, they're not struggling trying to keep the board in one place. Just move things so that it's easier for you to work on. So with that, you can see the capacitor was removed, and now it's basically just going to be replacing all the capacitors and going through the rest of the board and removing the rest of the capacitors and replacing them. So here is the replacement capacitor, and we just got to make sure that we orientate it correctly on the board so that the negative side of the capacitor goes into the negative hole on the board. You can see the negative side of the capacitor is usually marked by a black or gray or silver marking like that. It depends on the color of the rest of the capacitor, but typically it's a marking like this. It's time to take our replacement capacitor and put it through the empty through hole pads on the board, and then once we have it through, we just want to kind of move the legs to the side on the other side of the board so that the capacitor stays in place. With the capacitor in place, we're just going to add some liquid flux. Flux helps solder flow, so whenever you can, definitely use it. It will make your life easier. And we're just going to solder the capacitor in place. With the capacitor now in place, you're just going to want to take some flush cuts and cut off the excess legs. You want to hold the leg while you cut it, because if you don't, it'll just go flying, and if it gets stuck on the board, it could get caught in between some components and cause a short, and of course that would be bad. And now we're just going to replace the tape and put it back on there so that it's covering all the points that would touch the copper shielding. And we're going to put it back together, resolder the shield to those solder blobs, and replace the rest of the capacitors. So another cool thing by Console 5 is their wiki page that has capacitor diagrams for all the capacitor kits that they sell. In this case, we're going to use the Atari Lynx II one that you see on the screen now. It's very helpful because it'll show you the locations of the capacitors and also the little black lines that are on the insides of the capacitors designate the side of the negative leg. So using this diagram, you can place the proper capacitor in the proper location and make sure that you don't mess anything up. And I should also mention that the values for the capacitors are also on the wiki page. So like in this case, you could say like, hey, C39 is such and such value capacitor. So this makes it helpful because you can go and remove all the capacitors at once and then replace them and solder them all in at once, so you don't have to do it individually. If you're not comfortable doing it this way, then individually would be the way to go, so you can verify that you've got the right ones in. So you may have noticed while I'm removing these capacitors that I didn't prep the rest of the capacitor legs by adding fresh solder. For the most part, I got lucky, but I was just being lazy, and that's why I didn't do this. But for one or two of them, I did have to add fresh solder, and you may have noticed I just used the tip of the desoldering gun to add the fresh solder. Alright, so now I'm just putting the capacitors in and just using the guide that I showed earlier, and then going through and bending the legs so the capacitors stay in place and soldering them together. And then I'm just going to remove everything and make sure all the connections are good, and then we will test and make sure it works. Now with all the capacitors replaced, it's time to replace the battery connectors on this board. If you remember in part 1, we noticed that this board doesn't have battery terminals on it, so we're just going to take them from this scrap board and desolder them from here and solder them onto the good board. And I'm just going to do this by applying solder, or applying my solder and iron to the bottom of the legs for the terminal here, which should heat them enough for me to pull them out. And then I'm just going to swap them into the good board and solder them in. And you can see I'm removing the old solder from where the terminals used to be, just using some desoldering braid. And what I didn't show with the capacitors was, after I was done, I went and just cleaned everything up using 99% alcohol and a combination of Q-tips and a toothbrush. Just going to add some flux, put the tack that leg in place, and then flow some solder through everything to make sure it all sticks. Okay, so now I have it all together enough so we can test. Got it plugged in, got a game in it, because remember, the Atari Lynx II won't turn on without a game. And we hit the power button, and there we go. We get a light, and we get the Ninja Gaiden screen. So after the recap, this still works, so that's always good. Alright, so thanks for checking out this video, and be sure to stick around for part 3, where we replace the screen and upgrade it with a more modern screen. So in part 1, we got a board working by replacing the power unit. In this video, we recapped it for some preventative maintenance, and in part 3, we're going to upgrade the screen, because this one obviously isn't in the greatest shape, and get a more modern screen on this Atari Lynx. Again, thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you on the next one.